Today we're joined by Brendan Thomas, CEO of AUSTRAC, Australia's Financial Intelligence Unit and AML CTF regulator. Since taking on the role in 2024, Brendan has been at the centre of major regulatory reform, enforcement prioritisation, and the expansion of AML obligations across new sectors. We'll discuss how AUSTRAC is approaching risk, compliance and accountability as regulatory expectations continue to sharpen. Brendan identifies some critical themes that we think are compulsory listening for any board, any senior management across the country. So thank you, Brendan, for joining us on our podcast On Just Terms and being so generous with your time.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Great to be here.
Well, in this podcast, we're exploring the main sources of risk for corporate Australia. And we can't tell that story without looking at how our regulators are approaching the next 12 months and discharging their functions. And I'm a big fan of context, so perhaps we could start, even though it's a sophisticated audience, with a little bit about what AUSTRAC's focuses and priorities are going to be over the next 12 months.
Yeah, so AUSTRAC, as most of you know, has two major functions. We regulate businesses for their money laundering responsibilities. And through that regulation, we get a whole range of reports from those businesses that we use with other data to form intelligence that we work with law enforcement and national security on to uncover organised crime and basically to catch the bad guys. Our focus over the next 2 years is bringing a whole range of new businesses into money laundering regulation, what we call tranche 2 businesses, as well as implementing changed legislative obligations for those businesses that are currently under money laundering regulation. And our priority over the next couple of years is working with those businesses and industries to make sure they understand what those obligations are and are applying them effectively, as well as bringing in up to 80,000 new businesses into a regime that most of them have never heard of before and really don't know anything about. Yeah. But we're trying to do it while at the same time not dropping the ball on our current regulatory focus and doing as much as we can to work with law enforcement to crack money laundering and organised crime.
Excellent.
So Brendan, I know with all of these changes that are coming in, one of the things that you've said, and this is possibly more for the tranche 1 businesses, but you've said that the focus for the next little while will be on reducing harm rather than merely tick box compliance. Can you talk a bit about what that means in practice?
Yeah, Australia has a benefit, I think, of having its money laundering regulator and its financial intelligence unit in one place, which is us. And it means we really do focus our efforts on harm. We see what that harm is on the intelligence side of our business. We see where the financial crime is, the kinds of harm that's happening to our economy and to our community through organised crime and money laundering. And so we really then are focusing our regulatory efforts on where that harm is most manifest, where we see that money laundering happening, and working with businesses, one, so that they better understand what that harm is, and secondly, so that they're applying their efforts effectively to control their exposure to money laundering risk and harm, and thirdly, to work with us so that we're jointly working to crack organised crime and to better understand the illicit finance that we deal with in our economy.
So I know one thing that is a focus for organisations is really how board and senior management should respond. It can be quite challenging for board and senior management to really understand their role in all of this, particularly when some of the AML or CTF compliance obligations can seem very operational in focus.
Yes.
And so it would be really helpful if you can speak a little bit about what AUSTRAC's expectations of board and management are and how they can best serve the purposes that you expect of them.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing boards should realise and senior managers should realise is you are on the hook for your money laundering responsibilities in Australia. You are responsible for making sure that your business meets its AML obligations and that you're complying effectively with those obligations. That is your responsibility under the Act, and that's very, very clear, more clear under the reforms that commence in March than they probably were before. And it can be quite complex. I mean, we're often dealing with big businesses that have very complex operations, thousands, if not millions of clients and transactions, and complex AML programs. And the challenges for boards is where do you focus your effort and where do you focus your attention to know that you're being compliant effectively? And there are a few things boards should really focus on and where we would expect boards and senior executives to pay attention. Under the new legislation that commences in March, very clearly on risk assessments. So any board should really properly understand the money laundering risk that its business is exposed to and make sure that their risk assessment is thorough and effective and that they as a board understand it and are very confident in it. And my advice is to focus on a number of areas there. One is understand the types of services that your company provides and how those services might be exposed to money laundering risk. Secondly, understand the channels through which you provide service. So understand the risk involved in the way your business conducts its business. Obviously, a business that deals with face-to-face services with clients has a different kind of risk and a different nature of controls than a business that might be completely digital, for example. The third is to understand your customers, the customers that you're dealing with and the nature of their dealings with you and what risk that might expose you to. A business that deals largely in transactions, like a real estate company, for instance, has a different kind of risk to one that might be dealing with established corporate companies, to another that might be dealing with companies in multiple jurisdictions. The fourth area is to focus on where you do business. So what risks your business is exposed to by the jurisdictions that you might deal with. And that's quite variable around the world. Some countries have higher levels of money laundering and illicit finance risk than others, and some countries have much tighter controls than others. We often refer people to the Basel Index on AML assessments as a good base source for that. So one, businesses really need to understand their risk, and the board should be across that risk. And secondly, boards really need to focus on their business getting some of the basics right. Where we see people go wrong is where those basics are wrong. And those are things like how you onboard clients, making sure that your company is confident that it knows who it's doing business with and why it's doing business with that person. So who are your customers and why are they coming to you for the business that they're doing? And monitoring that and making sure that that's really clear and quite specific. Being really clear about what happens when those customers expose the business to greater risks, and there being very clear escalating activity when those risks themselves escalate, and an activity happens from that. And then being really clear about the kinds of reports that you're looking at as a board and the kinds of reports that you should be sending to us, and making sure that those reports are matching your risks and matching those controls. We would expect boards to be across those things and to be regularly looking at those things. Good boards that are really compliant and are doing a good job are looking at those kind of indicators on a regular basis. What are their risks? Are their controls matching those risks? Are actions happening when those risks materialise? And are the reports they're sending to us and they're looking at themselves actually matching those risks? Good example, if I can give you an example.
That'd be great.
Some of the risks we saw in the casino sector, for instance, were people coming from overseas with buckets of cash, turning up to a casino with $1 million in cash, putting it down, gambling a little bit, and then withdrawing that money. Or worse, having the bank deposit that money in a bank account, or even worse than that, having the casino deposit that money in an account in another country. Really easy way for people to launder money, and a common way organised crime was laundering money through Australian casinos. Casinos now put a whole bunch of controls in place to try and limit that. And you can see good boards managing those businesses, looking at their cash dealings, looking at cash deposits versus play, cash withdrawals versus winnings, international funds transfers coming from those businesses. And we look at those bits of data coming from those businesses as well. But boards should be across those kinds of things and looking at those things regularly. The new legislation really heightens the role of your AML compliance officer, and it does that quite specifically so that that person is a senior person in the business, and we expect that person to have direct access to senior executives and to the board. So the board should know that person and should be hearing from that person pretty regularly. Really good boards often appoint a board member as being like an AML expert or an AML champion, so someone to get much more familiarity with not only AML laws, but how people might be laundering money through businesses like theirs. And that really helps boards ask the right questions of senior executives and be probing senior executives about their own controls and their own compliance. And when we come and look at businesses, we'll look at your board minutes. We'll look at the reports the board's getting. We'll talk to the board about how well they understand their AML controls and their AML activities. And when I meet with boards, the boards I'm most confident with can actually talk to me about all of those things pretty openly and pretty easily because they've been involved in signing off on their risk assessments and their controls, and they're getting regular reports on how they're progressing. There's a couple of things we expect to happen in big business. One, we expect mistakes to happen. We expect controls to fail. We expect people to make assumptions that otherwise aren't right and to need to make corrections. And we deal a lot with companies and with senior executives when they come to us and say, a control's failing, or we've found a problem that we otherwise didn't know. Can you work with us to help fix that? And we always do. We always work with companies to help them fix that. But we also expect people to try and launder money through businesses. The things that stand out for us is when we see companies reporting that they have no high-risk clients and they report no suspicious matters to us. I think some people worry that if they report things to AUSTRAC, that puts them on our radar. I can guarantee the exact reverse is true. If you're not reporting, we're looking for people that don't report, and we go and ask questions as to why you're not reporting.
That's so interesting, and thank you. There's some really useful tips there. Can I just follow up? When boards are looking at risk assessments, which clearly you've described they need to do, and senior management, one of the ways that they might seek to do that is to rely on third-party consulting firms that look at risk for them. To what extent can they get comfort from that?
Lots of companies rely on third parties in AML activity generally, from risk assessments to transaction monitoring programs. There's a lot of very good third-party consultants out there that do a great job. There are others that aren't and don't do such a great job. I think it's important to remind boards that they're ultimately responsible for their AML compliance. So they're responsible for the quality of those third-party assessments. They're responsible for getting them done. They can't outsource that legal responsibility to that third-party assessor or that third party that's doing that risk assessment, for example. They need to be comfortable and confident that that risk assessment is appropriate for their business, that it actually deals with the risks that their business is exposed to, that the controls it talks about are effective in managing those risks, and then ultimately when they're put into effect, that they're actually working in the manner that the board expects them to work in. And that's the board's responsibility to make sure those things are right.
Thank you.
We are seeing, if I could move the focus a little bit to what I'll call the big end of town, in the discussions that Bryony and I are having with boardrooms and large clients across the country, there is, as you'd expect, ever increasing focus on the financial crime platform and perhaps how it could be uplifted and evolved. Now, I'm just a humble class actions lawyer. This is Bryony's area of expertise, but even I can see it's a complex area.
Very complex.
And for the large organisations, it's manifoldly more complex and a lot of involvement of technology. You've touched on some of these themes earlier, but I was wondering, what would AUSTRAC's expectations be that should be top of mind for the large end of town in assessing where it sets its financial crime risks and also how it evaluates the performance of those risks, of those controls?
Really importantly, the new legislation puts risk at the centre of this new regime. That's really important. Can't emphasise it strongly enough. And in our work, we emphasise risk as much as we possibly can. And it comes back to that harm question you raised earlier. Why do we do this? Because we want to make it harder for criminals to profit from crime, not because we want to tick a whole bunch of compliance boxes. And what we do see in the big end of town is people trying to get absolute coverage of everything, rather than understanding and identifying what their clear financial crime risks are and focusing hard on those.
I see.
We want people to focus hard on those. So understand what your predominant risks are, focus on getting those risks right. When it comes to upgrading the big system, some of the challenges we do see is where people haven't got their fundamentals right. Their data's not clear, the onboarding of customers isn't done correctly, there's inconsistencies in the way that they collect data, they scale up their program and their program is becoming much bigger with dirty data in it.
See.
Getting those kinds of things right at the start is fundamentally important. Clean data, clearly structured data, good onboarding processes for customers before you scale up. But we're seeing a greater use of artificial intelligence in financial crime programs, particularly in transaction monitoring. We strongly encourage that. We think that's a good thing. We think where banks are turning from compliance, reporting entities, not only banks, are turning from compliance to building financial crime intelligence functions. There's a much better use of their resource and their investment, and we would certainly support that and work with businesses to do that. But focusing on risk and focusing on controls around that risk is really important. So again, simply coming back to that first principle of understanding your risks, making sure your controls are directed towards those risks, and then making sure your controls are working in the way that you intend them to work.
It's valuable guidance.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, which is just when reporting entities are focusing on their risk, what are they focusing to do? And that's in a way an obvious question, but are they focusing to find it and note the level of risk? What's expected from AUSTRAC in terms of the output of the risk monitoring?
Yeah, a number of things. So we see businesses giving us suspicious matter reports, which is really valuable. We want those. We want businesses to report suspicion to us. We use those all of the time. We want to assure businesses that all the time and money you're investing in putting those reports to us is going to a very, very valuable end. So we expect reporting and intelligence and insight. We then expect businesses to take greater levels of control when they're seeing those risks. So what are you doing to limit the harm you're exposed to from those risks? Again, if I give you a good example, we've got a big problem in Australia of what we call money mule accounts. So either bank accounts that are created through fake personalities or fake documents, or where criminals have got a regular account holder who's happy to launder money on their behalf. Pretty significant problem. We've worked with banks to identify red flags to better understand those mule accounts, and banks are now closing down tens of thousands of them every year. We expect that kind of activity to happen. So they're seeing a risk. Not only are they reporting that risk, but they're taking action to shut that risk out. We've seen financial institutions put in place a whole range of controls to limit access to risk around ATM machines, cash dealing, for instance. Lots of businesses won't deal with cash in certain circumstances because of the money laundering risk that exposes them to. So we do expect them to take controlled changes in the way they might deliver that service that can effectively control that risk. Sometimes businesses wonder how much risk can they actually hold. So they might be exposed to a channel that exposes them to risk. How can they hold that risk?
Yes.
Can they manage that risk, or do they shut it down altogether? Ultimately, that's a decision for a business to make as to how much risk they're prepared to expose and hold. They can always talk to us about that. And we have had discussions with major financial institutions that are exposed to particular significant risk, where we've had discussions about we're happy for you to carry that risk for a whole range of reasons, which we won't publicly talk about, but where that's a good thing to do and we're happy for you to carry that level of risk. Talk to us about it, particularly talk to law enforcement about it if you're really worried about that. But yeah, so to report risk, to take action to try and limit that risk as you're being increasingly exposed to it, sometimes to sit with that risk if it's okay to sit with. We do expect people to successfully launder money through businesses. We're not naive. We know there's billions of dollars that go through our economy every year through money laundering, and money launderers are actually pretty good at what they do. They're pretty organised. They invest in technology. They invest in skills and expertise. Many of them are very, very effective at what they do, and they do get through the best controls that get put in their place. So we do expect to see that. But businesses can sit with risk. But again, it's up to that risk assessment and the risk appetite a business is prepared to hold.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Coming back to something that you said earlier, and I think repeated then, from time to time things go wrong.
Yeah.
And you've said that AUSTRAC understands that. I'm sure though you've seen in terms of businesses seeking to manage the outcomes when those things go wrong, businesses taking missteps and businesses doing that really well.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. The first point for businesses doing really well in managing those missteps, or where they see risks that they've been exposed to that they otherwise haven't picked up very well, is one, to recognise it pretty clearly. Secondly, to talk to us about it as soon as they possibly can. Your fate is always better the earlier we know about those risks and what you're doing about it. Secondly, to take pretty quick corrective action to try and address that risk. And where we see businesses doing that really well, it's about understanding where something's gone wrong and focusing on the outcome you're trying to achieve rather than the process to get there. So if you've got a bunch of risks that you're exposed to and the control is a different transaction monitoring program or changes to that transaction monitoring program, you need to be really clear about what the outcome is you're trying to achieve, because the program might not always get you there. And we'll come back and have a look at that risk, and you still might be exposed. You might have implemented that program, but you still might be exposed to that risk. And we do see failures in businesses where they focus on implementation and delivery and forget the risk they're trying to close off, and not focus on whether what I'm doing is addressing that risk effectively or not.
Yeah. If we can then go to the part that nobody wants to be in, enforcement.
Yes.
AUSTRAC has obviously, for some years now, been increasingly active in the enforcement space and using a lot of tools available at your disposal. Can you talk a little bit about enforcement priorities for the year ahead, or how you see your enforcement evolving?
Yeah, so it's evolved a lot over the last few years, from I think, an approach that initially it didn't involve much enforcement at all to one that involved a very heavy focus on civil actions. We're focusing now on looking at all of our enforcement tools, from civil actions at one end to communicative actions on the other end, and how we use all of those tools together to try and affect change, which is what we're really on about. Is not just how do we penalise a company for breaching the law, but what's the effect that we want to have because of that action, the broader effect that we want to have because of that action. And so we're looking at those kinds of enforcement tools right across the board. You would have seen us last year, we took action against some non-bank lending businesses. We had a concern, one, that almost none of those businesses were identifying high-risk customers. I think it was 2 or 3 businesses that were responsible for all of the reports that we were getting. We had a problem with that part of the industry. We took some regulatory action against a couple of businesses, and I wrote to every other business in that whole cohort, there's about 1,200 businesses, to say, we've got concerns with your money laundering controls, and listed what those concerns were, and then wrote about the kinds of improvements that we'd like to see. And we're now going back and having a look to see whether those changes have been made, and if not, we'll be taking action against some other businesses. But where we see kind of egregious fault, where we see people really not paying attention to money laundering risk, having major failings in their programs, we'll continue to take civil action against those businesses. And we've got a number of matters currently before the court. And we've got a whole program of activity that's currently happening. But where we are focusing our effort is cash exposure. So for us, cash dealing is a big challenge in money laundering. The use of cash in the Australian economy obviously is shrinking. The use of cash in the criminal economy isn't. And so we chase cash throughout the economy. We look at where it is and we chase that down and hopefully find good controls in place of businesses that are using cash. We're looking at board responsibilities. So we are looking at those industries where we see greater money laundering risk and whether boards are oversighting their responsibilities effectively and managing their controls effectively. We're looking at reporting. So we are now looking at where we're getting no reports, where we're getting low reports, or where the reports coming out of businesses and industry sectors are matching the risk that we see. And if we're not, we're making further inquiries. We're very concerned about digital currency in the Australian economy. And so we've got a big focus on digital currency businesses, particularly the automatic teller machines in that area, but digital currency in general is a risk for us.
A related but perhaps narrower question. One thing about risk is it's never one thing, and what we are seeing is where AUSTRAC might be pursuing an investigation or even an enforcement step, it's not inconceivable that another regulator, ASIC, APRA, might be pursuing their own matter, and add to that potentially the risk of a class action, particularly a shareholder class action. I'm sure those multiple risks don't impact the way AUSTRAC would pursue its mandate, but are you seeing it impact the way corporate Australia, its level of openness with AUSTRAC, its desire to cooperate, its ability to be candid? Is that impacting relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to emphasise is we work very closely with the other regulators. So ASIC and APRA, we work very closely with, we take joint action. With them, we have a regular meeting where we share work that we're doing. So we all know who we're looking at and what we're looking for. We try and do that as much as we can with state regulators as well. So there is a lot of sharing amongst that regulatory group. The openness we have to business is quite variable. So we have parts of the regulated industry that we work with where we do have very open relationships with. People talk to us regularly. They escalate matters to us all of the time. To others where we'll knock on the door and the door will be shut in our face. Not a good idea.
I imagine.
Generally not a good idea for someone to do. But we do have that. We do have that, depending on the businesses that we're dealing with and the industry that we're in. So we find those industries where we have taken enforcement action are usually more open to us.
Yes, yes.
Those ones which we're newly approaching, perhaps not as open as you might otherwise hope initially, they usually then do become more open and communicative with us. Whether in the mind of corporate Australia is those other consequences, yes, I think they are.
Right.
And it's not only other regulatory action, it's not only shareholder class actions. I mean, we've seen in the last year, we've announced that we're looking at regulatory action against the business and that business's share price in another country drops. I mean, it's effects all over the place.
Yeah.
And I mean, the last thing a business wants is an enforcement action from an AML regulator.
Yeah.
It affects that business for many years. You'll find yourself, as many financial businesses do, having to explain your level of risk to international clients and customers. It exposes your business to ongoing risks all over the place. I think the risks are higher in the ongoing area than they might be in the initial fine or the initial penalty. If it is affecting people's thinking, they should dispel that from their thinking, though. I mean, if AUSTRAC comes knocking on your door, my advice to boards and businesses is to open that door and be as cooperative as you can.
Yeah. Well, you've been very generous with your time, and perhaps we could end with one question, which is, it's a rare opportunity. Your insights have been incredible. It's a rare opportunity to sort of receive some messages from the regulator in peacetime. Is there any messages you'd like to leave in terms of the ambitions of AUSTRAC over the next period of time, or their goals, or things that you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Yeah, look, we don't regulate for its own sake. There is a significant problem of organised crime in Australia, of illicit finance. Many billions of dollars. I mean, I mentioned earlier the illicit drug trade. That alone in Australia is worth more than $12 billion. People are probably familiar with the illicit tobacco problem. You see it on the news all the time. The estimates are it's between $7 and $8 billion. Those two crime types on their own are $20 billion that flow through our economy every year. All of that money, every cent is illicit. Every cent is laundered through the Australian economy. It's a massive problem. Yeah. And that's only one part of the problem. So we're here to really make our country safer, make our economy safer, to protect the public from organised crime. So work with us to help us do that. That's really what we want business to do.
It's been a pleasure having you on our podcast and being so grateful with your time, gracious with your time. Thank you very much, Brendan.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. As we close today's discussion, one theme stands out clearly. Financial crime regulation is not a peripheral compliance issue. It sits at the very centre of corporate risk management. Brendan's perspective underscores the seriousness of financial crime in Australia and the high expectations that AUSTRAC has of the role that its regulated entity should play in alleviating the risk of financial crime through their businesses. With major AML/CTF reforms in this country currently underway and new sectors being brought into this important area of regulation for the first time, what comes through is the importance of preparation, assurance, and good governance. This is not just about meeting technical requirements, but about understanding and engaging with financial crime risk, embedding systems, processes, and controls that are truly fit for purpose, and being able to demonstrate genuine capability and commitment in this area at all levels across organisations. For those navigating these changes, the challenge is to stay ahead of the regulatory expectations while maintaining operational resilience. These are issues that will continue to shape the regulatory landscape in the years ahead. Thank you for joining us on Just Terms. We look forward to continuing our conversation as these regulatory expectations continue to evolve.